We're going to move into our next thing, the fun stuff. How do we actually engage now with the community, right? We've been talking about, so we're assuming at this point, you've prayed, and you've been listening to the people around you, and you're starting to develop some of those friendships and relationships and those natural spots where you can share. So now it's time to actually engage with the community. So what do we do? And so as we begin this section, I want to talk to you about this concept you see in Scripture of what's called the person of peace. And oftentimes in communities, you encounter this person of peace, this person that essentially opens up a vehicle for the gospel and for people coming to faith. And so what a person of peace is it's not necessarily another Christian. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It's just somebody in the community in which you find favor with, that wants to be a part of helping you for whatever reason. And oftentimes we miss it because we usually think that the goal of this person of peace, it's about this person right here. But it's not always just about this person right here, but rather it's about the entire community of people they're connected to. And it's not even always about what's going to happen here, but oftentimes it's about what they bring here and what they open up to you. And then in that moment, you will find that networks of people can get connected through this person of peace. And so in a community, oftentimes when you're praying and you're trying to engage with the community, this person will start to kind of come on your radar and make you known. Maybe it's somebody that you naturally gravitate toward and build a relationship with. Or somebody that just gets connected with you and all of a sudden they become like a blessing to you. So think about in Scripture, persons of peace. Zacchaeus probably would have been a person of peace because when Jesus went to the community and he partied with Zacchaeus, he all of a sudden got connected with this whole community of people, right? Disconnected from faith. But a person of peace is somebody that can help you connect with the community around you. They have natural relationships and connections in there. So I'll give you a story because it's always easier with a story. I remember a couple instances where we had this person of peace thing. The first, when I was first in Knoxville, I was always sharing faith with everybody and what we were doing at the church. And I remember encountering this stylist named Jess Ronning. And I remember going out and sitting in her chair and we were talking about faith. I was like, man, she sounded really interested. And then my buddy Cameron went and talked to her. And she had given me her card and said, tell us more about the church. But somehow I had lost the card, right? Brilliant. Yeah, that was the church planner in me. But once again, God showed up, right? Wasn't about what I could do. And I'm sitting there fretting about it. And Liza at the time just looks at me and she goes, here's an idea. Why don't you just go get a haircut? I was like, brilliant. So I went and got a haircut, connected with Jess again, and she starts coming out to the church. Well, Jess ends up being connected with this whole network of people that were disconnected from church, or some that were connected to church but had a spouse that wasn't connected. And she just starts inviting people out to the church like crazy. She was a person of peace. Through that person of peace, I got connected to a whole network of families. I got to do, at one point, I got to baptize a couple whole families, which was really fun. And they were all people that were connected to Jess, and Jess was so passionate about what was going on, she would just invite people out. So she was an example of somebody that started coming to faith and was in faith that then brought other people into faith from her network of relationships. Sometimes the person of peace is somebody that is just connected to you, but they won't necessarily connect with faith. I remember I used to go into this Starbucks and I got connected to this guy, David, who was one of the guys that would work at the Starbucks, and we would talk and stuff like that. Well, one day, David's cousin, Nails, was trying to find a church to go to. He's like, I want to go back to church. I need to find one. David, who didn't go to church, who just knew me, said, you should check out The Point. They're great. He had never one time been in there. He just knew me and saw me at the coffee house all the time, and he's like, I'll invite Nails in. And Nails had heard some of our ads on the radio, so he started coming out. He started playing drums at the church. He started leading youth group at the church. He got incredibly connected and was a big blessing, and he got connected through his cousin David, who hadn't even come out to the church. I think years and years later, he came to one of our bar churches. But that's kind of what this person of peace concept is. And so in your community, you'll have these people that are connected to the community and become natural relational connections for you, whether it's opening up opportunities for you to serve a community or to even be served by the community, because that's another way to share faith, is to let other people serve you. And then also, as you're looking around, sometimes it happens that you're like, I don't know where the person of peace is. Well, sometimes, in some instances, you become the person of peace. You become the person that starts to be the relational connector for people in a community. That's what happened to us in New Jersey. Like, we came there, and my wife actually became this person of peace in our neighborhood. And she started gathering the ladies together, and they would do ladies' night. And all of a sudden, after a year of ladies' night, she's like, all the wives were talking, they're like, you guys would really enjoy each other. You should hang out. You should connect. So finally, I bit the bullet, and I'm like, I'll text all the guys, and I'll see who wants to come, right? That, when you all talk about like that, taking that leap of faith, right, and that kind of chasm you feel like you have to jump over, that was my chasm. I felt like really putting myself out there to text a bunch of guys that I barely knew, that my wife knew their wives, right? Like, hey guys, you want to come over and play? Like, it felt like that, right? So I send the text out, and I don't hear anything from anybody for like 12 hours. And I'm like, well, that was a fail. Won't do that again. 12 hours later, I got responses from like everybody. I was like, what happened? Do you know what happened? They were all getting permission from their wives to come out to a guy's night in the middle of the week. But all of a sudden, we had this huge guys' night, and now we have them regularly. Other people host them. Like, it's turned into this big community thing, and all of a sudden, our street has become this street where everybody's very deeply relationally connected because of the person of peace concept, which has opened up opportunities down the road to be able to share faith. And so when you're talking about engaging with your community, it's not something you have to figure out on your own. What you will sometimes find through prayer and through getting to know people is that God already has people in place, and he's already working on things in the community. And when you make a connection with one of those persons of peace, like, it could be a chance to share faith with somebody, or it could be a chance for somebody to open up a community of people you would not normally be connected to. And so that's really where it begins, is you start to pray not just for the disconnected people, but God, could you reveal to me who that person of peace is? Who's that person that can help me engage and connect in this place? Does that kind of make sense a little bit? Cool. So the other thing we can think about, and this is a really helpful thing, it comes from a pastor out of Chicago, and there's a really great book written on it. It's called The Bless Rhythms. And when you think about engaging with your community, think about the word bless. And it will give you kind of a system and a rhythm you can use to start engaging with your community and being able to start sharing the gospel. And so the way the bless rhythms break down is like this. It's also a little bit of a recap of all the stuff we've been talking about. Number one, begin in prayer. We come back to that because that's the most important thing, right? Whenever you're engaging with your community, don't think about it like you're opening up a box of IKEA furniture and you finish steps 1 through 3, and so now you're on to step 4 and you quit doing the other steps. But rather think about it as foundations that build on each other. So just because you're starting to engage with the community, you don't stop praying for the community. Keep being in prayer. And so the bless rhythm, think begin in prayer, be praying. And then the second part of that bless rhythm is what? Listen and engage. Which word is first? Listen, yes. Keep listening, right? We don't want to quit listening, but listen and engage, because the listening is going to show you when you could engage with the community. And then next, eat. How many of you eat? Some of you are liars, because I just saw you out there. Like, we're Lutherans. We are really good at eating, right? But meals are a natural opportunity to connect with people. How often did you see Jesus in the Gospels just simply sharing a meal with people? And here's the thing about a meal. a meal connects you relationally in a different way, right? You tend to have deeper conversations over a meal. You tend to connect in a more casual way over a meal, right? In fact, one of the principles they teach you in the workplace is if you've got a tenser meeting, do it over a meal. And it relieves some of that tension, right? It's because meals can be a powerful tool for engaging with the community. And here's the best part. Most of us are going to eat how many meals a day? 3 meals a day, right? How many days a week? 7 days a week, right? 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. What if you just gave away like 2 or 3 of those meals and you committed to just eating with somebody else? Eating with somebody that you could have a conversation with, that you could get to know, that you could share faith with. Like all of a sudden, 3 times a week, you're going to be intentionally connecting with the community. Like doing life together, learning who each other are, right? Getting natural opportunities to share stories with each other and faith. Just by doing what you were already going to do already. Like, and if you're in like a workspace and you're thinking there's all kinds of rules around work, right? And what we're allowed to talk about and not talk about and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes those rules tend to flex when? Around mealtime, right? And so maybe some days, instead of eating a meal at your desk so you can kind of like blow through your work, maybe eat with some of your coworkers. And you'll get to know them a little more and their story. Meals are an incredible place to do that. They're also an incredible vehicle to throw parties, right? Because parties are an incredible opportunity to meet people, right? And when you throw a party and you have a meal together, you get a chance to meet people on another level, build that relationship, and then naturally things start to pop up. Faith starts to pop up. And they don't all have to be things that you host. A big way that you're engaging with your community is when people invite you over, right? And when somebody invites you over, they give you an open door to invite them over. So definitely utilize meals as a way to connect with people. Next, serve. Serve your community. Find simple ways and big ways that you can be serving. If you're talking like corporately as a church, what are some of the biggest needs in the community around you? One of the best ways to figure that out is talk to some of the local leadership in the community. Sit down with, I don't know what it's called here. We have mayors, right? You all have mayors? Yeah, okay, mayors, good. You can sit down with like the mayors, the police chief, the fire chief, all these different people. They're much easier to access than we realize. And sit down and have a conversation with them. Ask them, hey, what are the 3 biggest things you see that our community needs? And then you don't have to fix all 3. Like, we're not the only church here, right? But we could pick one and be a part of starting to serve in that way. And as you begin to serve, you begin to build relationship with the community. Same with your neighbors. You can serve your neighbors. One of the big ways relationships started growing with our neighbors is doing simple things like, taking one of the kids to or from soccer practice, We had one friend that we got to start doing microchurch stuff with, and that was really fun, but we actually not this last Christmas, the Christmas before, Christmas 2021, it was Christmas Eve, and I found out 30 minutes before the kids' service that my wife had COVID. So all of a sudden, my Christmas Eve changed. Not a busy time, by the way, when you're a pastor. Kids coordinator really appreciated that. But I went home, recorded a message really quick, and I spent the rest of Christmas sitting there on the couch. And when you have COVID, you can't do anything, right? You're locked down. Well, guess who else had COVID? Because somebody gave it to somebody. Our friend. So she's at home with 3 kids. We're at home with 3 kids. We all have COVID. So we're like, let's quarantine together. So they would come over to our house during that week for meals. And so we would eat together and we would hang out together, and the relationship built because we were able to spend time together. I'm not suggesting you get COVID and give somebody else COVID that needs Jesus, okay? I did not say that. But what I'm saying is there's all kinds of opportunities there, even when you wouldn't think there's an opportunity there. And just take some time to serve one another. Because for her, being the single mom, like, how huge was it for her to not be locked down with all 3 kids depending on her 24/7, but to just be able to come to our house and share a meal with a couple other adults that could talk and do dishes, you know, where her kids could play with other kids. Because there's this weird dynamic. It's easier to parent children when there's other children together. I don't know how that works. It's still very weird to me. But it allows the kids to play together. And so all of a sudden it was this chance for us to serve one another. So look for opportunities to serve. And then finally, don't forget stories. Your story and their story. And what I would always encourage you, start with their story. If you start with somebody else's story, you get to know them more. But when they see that you're interested in their story, what do they become interested in? Your story, right? Like, they want to know more about you because you're learning more about them. And in those stories, you begin to grow in your relationship, you begin to grow in your depth of knowledge of one another, but also you know where it's best to approach things like the gospel. And you know when it's the best time to do it. And if it's the best time to do it. And it may be months, it may be years, it may be this natural thing that they just bring up. But the more you learn their stories, the more you're able to share the gospel in helpful ways. So then here's the quick question. I know sometimes we're thinking, okay, I'm sharing my story. When do I get to Jesus' story, right? Because this is the story that changes everything, right? And our story is good, but it's not this good. This is the story. So how do we share that? And how do we share that in a way that's normal, right? Because, you could be sitting there going, well, let me tell you my story. Hey, let me tell you Jesus' story. And they're like, what? Where did this come from? But your story is connected to whose story? Jesus' story, right? And so actually, without sharing a single bit of Scripture, you could actually still share Jesus' story. And there's a really simple formula for that, if you're wondering how you could share Jesus' story. And the formula is this. Your story has 3 basic parts. Your story has the before I met Jesus, my life before Jesus, connecting with Jesus, my life after Jesus. That's a really basic storyline that you can use to learn to tell the story, your story of how Jesus connected with you. Now, why are stories so powerful? You can't argue with a story. You can argue with a doctrinal point. You can argue with a section of Scripture. You can't argue with somebody's story. It's their story, right? That's what's so powerful about the gospel. It's a message that's embedded in a story. And so your story is just that. It's your story. And so when you're sharing your story with somebody, they can be hearing about Jesus as you share that story. Now, for some of you, especially if you came to faith as an adult, right? My wife came to faith as an adult. So she has this moment where she remembers what life was like before Jesus, and then what it was like to connect with Jesus, and what life was like after Jesus, right? But then you've got somebody like me. I was baptized as a baby in my grandmother's living room. I never remember a time where I lived outside the church. And then I went right from high school to college, took a year off, and then went to seminary, became a pastor. So even career-wise, I don't have a story before Jesus, right? Except for some lifeguarding. That's about it. So what does somebody like me do? Do I still have that story? Well, yeah, I do. Because there's all these moments in life where we're learning to die to ourselves and our own selfish needs, and we're learning to lean into and depend more on Jesus. So you can even take a point in your life and you can say, well, here's what it was like before Jesus. Here's what it was like when I connected with him. And now here's what it was like after. And if you notice, I've already done that a couple times. Like how I became a church planter. Before thinking about Jesus, I thought about just what I could do on my own. And then in connecting with Jesus and realizing I wanted to grow in that faith, I decided to step out and try something I knew I couldn't do. And now after Jesus, I've gotten to see him do amazing things, and my faith has grown incredibly. This was my life before Jesus. This is what happened when he connected. This is my life after. You can even do it with other things. Like when you walk through a hard season of life, right? And you come out of that season and you're like, I really struggled finding peace. And like people can relate with struggling to find peace, right? Because so many people, their peace is wrapped up in everything going the way it's supposed to go outside. And so peace is easy when things are clicking the way they're supposed to click. But then if something throws a wrench in that works, peace becomes a much harder thing to hold on to, right? And it's not just that way for non-Christians. Sometimes this is that way for us as Christians. Except Jesus does this beautiful thing where in the midst of those moments, he gives us a peace that can't exist within ourselves. And, you know, if you've ever lived through one of those moments where you didn't have peace, and all of a sudden God in his grace lines things up and reminds you of this deep reservoir of peace you have in Jesus, and it becomes one of those moments in your life where even though nothing has changed on the surface, everything changed. Like that's a powerful testimony because that doesn't happen for everybody. And people will look at you and go, well, how in the world could you find peace in that? Nothing changed. And you're like, yeah, but everything changed because I remember how much I have in Jesus and how even if I have nothing, I have everything. Now, you could look at me and say, nuh-uh, but you wouldn't argue with that, would you? Why? Because that's my story. And we don't tend to argue with stories. And you have a story too, and Jesus has connected to your story in a powerful way. And when you start to think about that, you can find ways to share that. And then there'll just be moments where it naturally pops up. And you get to share who Jesus is in your story. And then what people get to do is they get a picture of who Jesus is. That picture allows them to experience Jesus. And when they experience Jesus where they are, they can connect to him. And when they connect to Jesus, what do they become? A reflection of what they're connected to, which is Jesus. So when it comes to sharing your faith, you don't have to have the whole Bible memorized. It's good to know the Bible, but you don't have to. You don't have to know all the nuances of faith and theology. Those are good things to learn, but you don't have to. All you need to know is, here's what Jesus has done in my life, and I want to share that with you. Best example I can think of in Scripture with that, John chapter 4. Do you all remember John chapter 4? It's the woman at the well. Love that story. She's the woman that's had 5 husbands, and Jesus totally called her out on it, right? And she's sitting at the well, middle of the day. There's Jesus. He's waiting for her. He says, give me some water. He uses the water to talk about living water, right? She changes the subject because it's starting to get a little too personal. And then all of a sudden, Jesus lays out to her who he really is. And she realizes she's connecting with Jesus right there. She doesn't know exactly how the crucifixion is going to work or the resurrection or how Jesus is going to spread the gospel through the world. She doesn't understand all the nuances of faith Jesus does because Jesus mentioned earlier that she only uses the first few books of the Old Testament and not the whole thing like the Jewish people do. She's still struggling to figure out where you're supposed to worship. But she's all of a sudden connected with Jesus. She's found forgiveness that she didn't know was possible. And what does she do? She drops her bucket right there, runs back into the city to tell everybody, all the very same women and people that she was trying to avoid by coming to the well in the middle of the day. She runs to tell everybody about Jesus. And what does she say? She says, let me tell you about the doctrine of atonement. No. She says, you have to come see this guy who knew everything about me, Could he be the Messiah? That's all she knew. And she told everybody. And everybody started coming. And as that crowd of people start coming up and the disciples are back, do you know what Jesus said? The disciples are seeing this huge crowd come, and they're like, what in the world's going on? Because we're in Samaria. Jesus says, look, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And that's when he's talking about the harvest being those outside the church. So there's huge opportunity. Guess what? You don't have to be Pastor Matt or Pastor James or Martin Luther. You can just be the woman at the well who runs out to their friends and says, let me tell you what God did in my life. Yeah, I don't know all the nuances, but this is crazy. I want you to get to see it too. So that's really kind of simply what we're talking about with sharing faith. Okay, so I'm going to let you all discuss at your tables a little bit. And we've got our questions here. What stuck out to you in this session? What challenged you? And then finally, what would it look like for you to put this in practice in your life in the church? Maybe what's a story that you could share where your life encounters Jesus' life? Go ahead and share with your table now. What's an excuse for people to get together? Yes, it really is. Food is an incredible excuse to get people together. And in fact, around food, you can bring tons of people together. One of our big, the big missional thing that we did when we were at when we first lived in New Jersey, we had a bigger backyard and stuff. It was my wife's idea. She comes up with the best missional ideas, and I just put the stamp on it and approve. But she's like, let's have a summer kickoff party to like kick off the summer year. And I'm like, okay. So she's like, we'll make sliders, and everybody else can bring their other stuff. And I'm like, that'll be cool. We'll have a few friends in the backyard. Like 75 people showed up. It was awesome, right? Because our house was right next to the church, which had a little playground in there. So the kids would go over and play and move back and forth. And we did it a few years in a row before the pandemic. I think we did it like 3 years. And by the third year, there was like 100-some people. We were getting to know our neighbors really well. And food was the great catalyst and excuse to get people together. So, yeah. And you can do it around simple things like, there's all kinds of excuses. Like we've got the Super Bowl coming up in the States. And that's a great excuse to throw a party and have some people over. But we've done it for just regular football games too, or going over to a friend's house. So like, if there's a particularly good hockey game on, or if the Canucks make it to the Stanley Cup, like, you could throw a big party, right? I've heard it's been a while. James was telling me. So yeah, food's a great excuse, and I think one of the big things, and I would articulate it like this: a great way to connect with people about faith is to build the relationship around something that's not faith. And so that's why sometimes the best vehicle for sharing your faith is doing things you would already enjoy doing, right? So like, getting to sit down with y'all and talk to y'all, I've gotten to hear some like really fun hobbies, right? Traveling, that's a great, you have friends that you travel with, great way to share faith, right? You enjoy mountain biking or wakeboarding or skiing or snowshoeing or walking dogs or drinking coffee or craft beer or whatever it may be. Like all these things to us, we just call them, they're just hobbies, right? But they're also things that other people are also interested in. And they're opportunities to build relationships. And in those relationships, sometimes you'll get the opportunity to share faith. But I think the other really important thing is is you have to be willing to put in the time. Because nothing's going to be immediate, right? Faith is a crock pot thing in a microwave world, okay? We love to throw things in the microwave. It gets done really quick. But some things are just better when they're in the crock pot, right? And they've had the time to just sit for a while. And that's really faith. Faith is like that. It's a crock pot thing. And so you have to be willing to put in time. And I remember learning this one the hard way. I remember when I was in Knoxville, it was when I was first in ministry. So I was first in ministry, I was broke, but I also, my first child was young, so we had a little more free time. And so I was looking for something to do. I wanted to work out, wanted to hang out with people. So my wife's like, why don't you go to this free 5K run that happens at the craft beer store? I know, surprise, right? So we would do this 5K run, and like 100 to 200 runners would show up on a Monday night, every Monday night. And we would go out, we would do this run, all different running levels, and then you'd come back, and at the end of the run, you got $1 off really good local beer, and you'd hang out and connect, and it was just really fun on so many levels. But I was originally going because I wanted to connect with people on faith. And it was like a year, and I'd had 0 faith conversations. I was getting in great shape, but I had 0 faith conversations. And I remember this moment when I was like, maybe this Monday night thing is not the best use of my time. And it was probably a few weeks after that God opened up an opportunity for faith conversation. And then we got to start doing the 5K run series. And then I started noticing some people come out to church that I had met at the run. And what I realized was I just sometimes have to be willing to put in the time and just be present and let God be responsible for the results. So if you enjoy doing it, be in those places that you enjoy doing those things, because you will build the most natural relationships there. And through building those relationships, eventually you might get the opportunity to share more about yourself or about life, or to be present for somebody when they would need Jesus, but they don't have anybody else in their life connected to Jesus. And you get to be that connection. And that's why I love teaching people about sharing their faith. Because it's like looking at somebody and go, do you enjoy doing fun things? I want you to do more of those. And then I'll teach you how to share Jesus while you're doing the things you already want to do. And so that's kind of the cool opportunity we have in this. Yeah.